And rightly so. Let me start again. With him there was his son, the young squire, a ruler and a lusty bachelor, with raucous crow, as they were laid in press. Of 20 year of age he was. Yes. Well, Locus, now he spells it in this text L-O-K-K, 2 Ks, L-O-K-K-E-S. But it means the lock of hair. Today we spell it L-O-C-K, but it means a lock of hair. And his locks, now this young squire has, not just has hair, he has locks of hair, like goldy locks, like
they hang down in curls.
And a crow is a curl, C-R-U. In later English, it got to be C-U-R. There's a lot of that in the history of language. That is transpositions. The word two in English, the number two, T-W-O, was once pronounced two, and now it's pronounced two. So there are those, what do you call them, reversals, or... That's a word. Yeah, you used the right word just a minute ago. The linguists have gone over this and given it all a jargon, but it simply means curl. He has curly locks. He says, with locus crow, as they were laid in press. That is as if he went to the hairdressers and got his hair curled. And maybe he did. I mean, Chaucer is making fun of him, quite clearly making fun of him. But don't misunderstand the squire. He's a marvelous young man. I mean, Chaucer is making a very fond, affectionate fun. In fact, I think the squire is the best guy in this whole thing. I'd give him the prize. I think he's just marvelous. But he's terribly vain about his hair. Now, we're talking about a young squire in the last of the ages of chivalry. And they were crazy about their hair, even then, or especially then.
You know, it's we call it an ornament. An ornament's a very important thing. You have to have ornamentation. We say, I think we said this before, in Latin, people would talk about the fingers on your hand as being ornaments of your hand, and the hand as being an ornament of your arm. It's something added on. An ornament is something jointed on to your the fingers are jointed onto your hand, and they have to do with the beauty of the hand. You say, well, you don't have to have a hand to be a human being, but they're ornaments. But the ornaments are very, very important. And verse is a kind of ornamentation. We tend to think of ornaments as something that's superfluous, that you can do away with, that's unnecessary. And you say, well, that's true. They're not strictly, in the strict sense, necessary for poetry. But on the other hand, they are. Poetry is at its greatest with that ornament of verse.
It's a little like Dante's lines we closed on last time. St. Bernard's hymn to the Virgin Mary, when he says, I suppose, St. Bernard says it's possible to get to heaven without Mary. That's without a devotion to Mary. But you'd be an awful fool if you tried to do it without her. Right. And one of the words that's used of Christ himself is decor. That is, he has an ornamental beauty about him. In the hymns and in the psalms, that word occurs. In the Latin version of the psalms and in the Latin hymns that we were talking about, that word decor, the English word that derives from it is decoration. And it's one of the words for beauty.
Right, exactly, decoration.
And it's that external, it's the beauty of appearance. There's a formal beauty which is invisible, which comes from the soul of things. Sure, that's true. That's the interior, that depth of beauty. But there is also the surface. And poetry does have to do a lot with surfaces. It has to do with the appearance of things.
And the sounds here are that's the surface of verse.
The soul of poetry is not verse. The soul is invisible. The soul is I don't know what the soul of lyric poetry is. The soul of lyric poetry is something from heaven. That is, I think it must be the Holy Spirit. It's grace. That is, it's the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in the thing. Aristotle, remember, says that of poetry in general, he's thinking there of story. That is, of narrative poetry or of drama. He says the soul is the myth. But when you deal with lyric poetry, you don't really have a myth. That is, you don't tell a story, you get a kind of direct intrusion of grace. And just as grace operates in our souls by taking our souls and lifting them up in poetry, the soul of the poetry intrudes and lifts up.
That's exactly what St. Thomas says happens in the Psalms. There's the Psalms, the end of the Psalms, he says, it's prayer. And what happens in prayer is that you are lifted up to God. And the poetry of the Psalms has that effect of lifting us up to God.
It's the action of grace. That's true of lyric. I think that's the lyric.
Yeah,
well, I grant the psalm is inspired by God. I mean, you can have a bad lyric that may lift you up for a while and lift you down to the devil. I mean, you could have an evil lyric.
Yes.
So St. Thomas there was talking about the psalm, which is holy poetry. But the definition is the same.
Yeah, well, in fact, of course, this whole idea is anticipated by the pagans in the idea of the muse as inspiring poetry, as inspiring the lyric. It's poetry itself that the muse inspires. And so there was always the idea that in poetry there is some element of the divine, even among the pagans.
So that's the soul that we're here now.
Soul, yes.
Now, verse is not soul. That's the point we're making. No. Verse is the ornament of poetry. Therefore, you can have a poetry without the ornament, just as you can have a man without hair, or even without hand, as you say. But we would say, don't underestimate the importance of common accidents. If I were a philosopher, I'd write a treatise on the importance of common accidents. We have to make philosophical distinctions here. There are essences and accidents. And a lot of people think that because something doesn't have to be, that it's therefore disposable. Well, if you don't need it, throw it out. That's not true. In every species, there are what we call common accidents. Now, for example, that a dog is dirty because he's been running out there in mud is an accident. Dogs are not essentially dirty. But dogs are commonly dirty. I mean, you say, dirty dog. I mean, there is something rather shocking about a clean dog. Now, I'm
rare.
I've been to these dog shows where they give the dogs shampoos and baths, and there's something, to say the least, artificial about that. That's not in the nature of a dog.
Dogs are supposed to smell.
Yeah.
Cats, on the other hand, you see, are clean. You never talk about
dirty cat. No.
They're not. They're clean.
They're always licking themselves and wiping their faces and stuff.
And they don't smell the way dogs smell.
Yeah.
I know. I've got a dog. I wake up in the morning. He comes into the bedroom, and I wake up, and the first thing I see him looking right into my eyes, and then I can smell him.
Well, and that's fine. I mean, if you love a dog, by golly, you want him to be doggy.
Yeah.
What is I was going to say Eliot, but it isn't. It's W.H. Auden has that line about the dogs go on with their doggy life. And he's using that, the modern English poet Auden uses that phrase precisely to explain the ordinary and the common. Mm-hmm. That is, in that poem, he's contrasting an extraordinary event with the ordinary. Yeah. It's a poem about Icarus falling out of the
Yeah,
sky.
we talked about it recently.
Yeah, did we?
On
the tape, you
yeah,
mean?
yeah, we did.
Yeah. It's a very good poem. I hate to say it because I don't particularly admire Gordon, but he's awfully good. And he's a practitioner of English poetry and verse. He's marvelously clever. One of the best writers of doggerel, incidentally, in our time.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very clever. But in that poem, he contrasts the extraordinary with the common, and he uses the dog. The dogs go on with their doggy life.
Oh, there's a dog in the picture, isn't there?
I think there is.
We talked about the picture.
Bruegel's painting.
Bruegel's painting, yeah.
Yeah. And he says somehow, anywhere, in a corner or something like that, life, the ordinary life goes on in the face of this extraordinary event. Well, we ought to have a treatise on the importance of not only the accidental, but now we'll go one step further. Technically, there's something called a common accident. Now, actually, the fact that a dog is dirty is, I don't know, I have to make a distinction here. Strictly speaking, that wouldn't be classified as a common accident, because a common accident, according to the philosophers, is the definition of a common accident is that it's always present, everywhere.
Yeah,
but it doesn't have to be. And they give the example of tails, a dog having a tail and canine teeth. Scientists who do not know, after all, what a dog is. Nobody knows what a dog is. There's no way that we can penetrate into the real essence of a dog. We just simply don't know. The mind is not capable of discovering that. But we are capable of classifying the species on the basis of its common accidents. That is, if it has canine teeth and a tail, and I'm not a scientist, probably a certain number of vertebrae, they have these scientific definitions. Those are definitions by common accidents. Now, we do know there are dogs that don't have tails. There are
tailless.
Pembroke corgis don't have tails. And you say, well, that is surprising. But in general, we say commonly dogs have tails. Well, commonly, now I think here we can say verse is a common accident of poetry. I think it's fair to say that. That is, it's just about always present. It's true that Baudelaire, for example, wrote some striking stuff. He calls them little poems in prose. And he is the origin of the phrase prose poem.
People began writing them in the 19th century.
But that's a modern experiment. And one would say, well, sure, I mean, and they're very good, and hooray. And then, of course, we got into all kinds of aberrational stuff. But commonly, if you look at the history of poetry, I think you would say, commonly, if a man wants to write poetry, he writes it in verse.
You in fact, in prose, you try to avoid, in good prose, you try to avoid any very close approximation to verse.
It would be an affectation if you did.
Affectation.
Yes.
If you start rhyming, I know I do this. I'll be writing.
Yeah, you have to
all of a
read
sudden
it
I
before you
realize
write.
I've got to rhyme there. I've got to get that out of there. That's verse. That doesn't belong in or a too steady and common a rhythm. You say, oh, that's now I'm getting into verse. You've got to stop that. You're writing prose, and prose is a different. How did Milton call it? The other harmony. Yeah. The other harmony of prose.
Isn't that nice?
And it's marvelous.
I hate to tell you what I was going to say. I was going to say medium.
Yeah, there you go.
And I would have been so wrong.
There you go, yeah.
Milton's a poet.
Yeah.
Harmony.
The other harmony.
The other harmony. Gee, that's a good title for an essay.
Isn't it? Yeah.
That's lovely. That's a lovely phrase.
Yeah, but it is an other harmony.
Yes,
it's not the same harmony, and there is a harmony in prose, and it can be absolutely marvelous. But
we're going to say to everyone listening to this tape is this: the habit of verse is lost. That is, in your generation, you young people out there, it has been lost. As I was saying about 15 minutes ago, it used to be that doggerel was such a part of everybody's life. It was everywhere. It was in the newspapers. It was on the radio. It was just absolutely everywhere. And I don't know of anybody today who's famous for writing doggerel.
Not at all. Not right now. if some, I've known a few modern poets who are capable.
Yeah.
You know, they can do it if you kind of prod.
Well,
them,
that
they can do it.
fellow Betjeman could do it.
Yeah,
The English
yeah.
poet.
Yeah.
John Betjeman, who I think again was a genius, but he was of the last generation.
He's an old man, and he was considered an old fogey
Right.
by everybody.
Yeah.
But it used to be really that.
But you
on
mean
the
young poets can do it?
I know one who did it. I don't know if he does it regularly, but he wrote a kind of Ogden Nash type poem. It was quite good too, very funny and witty.
He was wonderful.
Yeah, but it used to be really that this was an ordinary accomplishment of any educated person. That is, if someone came to you and said, "Here, would you inscribe this book?" You know, you give someone a book and you say, "Well, you didn't inscribe it." They would write a piece of doggerel. And just like that, on the spur of the moment, they'd be able to do that. I can't do that. I can do it if you give me an hour or two.
Somebody invites you over.
Yeah.
He gives you an invitation to supper. You sit down and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't get there," but you turn it into a funny little thing. And there are, of course, famous examples of doggerel rising to poetry. Ben Jonson, for example, who is one
uninviting,
master on inviting a friend to supper, which is a masterpiece and a poem.
Yeah.
That is, he draws it out. But Ben Jonson was the kind of man who was not only capable of writing doggerel, I don't think he ever spoke prose. I mean, that guy probably spoke in doggerel. I mean, from what we know about him, his friends say that he would sit at the tavern and talk all night, and poetry would just spill on the floor. That is, there was a cafe life or a tavern life in English Elizabethan times, and so back in the time of Chaucer, where everybody could do this, and they not only could do it, but they did do it. What else did they do? They danced. We've talked about dancing. The squire. Read that description. Squire is a young fellow, 20 years old. With him there was his son, a young squire, a lover and a lusty bachelor, with lockes cruel as they were laid in press. Of 20 year of age he was, he guessed. Of his stature he was of even length, that means he was of medium height, and wonderly deliverer, and of great strength. He was quick. The word deliverer means agile, I think, and great strength. And he had been some team in Chivachi, in Flanders, in Artois, and Picardy, and borne him well, as of so little spas, in hope to standen in his lady grass. That is, in Chivachi means he had ridden on horseback into battle.
Cavalry raids is the way I got it translated.
Yeah. So, I mean, this young man is not just some sort of little pansy with his long curly locks. He was a real young soldier, and his life had been on the line in these battles, and borne him well, he says, as also little spots, in hope to stand in his lady grass. That is, he was a lover, and everything he did was to stand in the grace of his lady. And brooded was he, as it were a maid, as his clothes were fantastically full of embroidery and flowering.
Like a meadow.
Like it says, full of flesh of flowers, wheat and red. Singing he was, or fluting all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Now, he was singing and fluting. He could play the flute. Now, we don't want to miss a single thing. He was, what I think today we would have to say, an accomplished musician. That is, he was an amateur, you know, but by golly, he could play the flute. And I bet you when he sang, he could sing. That is, it wasn't just, yeah. These fellows could sing very elaborate. I mean, we had a lot of medieval music that comes out of we're talking here about the late 14th century. This squire lived in the time of, the second half of the 14th century, the wars of England and France largely, and the last flower of chivalry. Short was his gown, that is his gown, with sleeves long and weed. Well could he sit on horse on fair reed. Oh, that's really important. Chaucer remarks that about other people. He remarks that about Troilus. This fellow knew how to ride a horse. And not everybody does. Not even in an age of chivalry did everybody know how to ride a horse.
So all of these people are mounted, of course. All of them are riding horses, but not all of them ride well.
Well, one of them's a sailor, for example, and he's not too good. And some of them are drunk. They don't do too well. But this is a remarkable young fellow. Now, but this is the line I was trying to find, and here it is. He could have sung us mock on well indeed, just make dance, and well portray and read. Now, I think we have to go over every one of those words. He could have sung us mock. Isn't it Dorothy Sayers who has a whole book called The Mind of the Maker? Is that her book?
Yes.
Who wrote? Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very good title.
Mm-hmm.
The Maker.
Mm-hmm.
That is, God made heaven and earth, and the poet is a maker. That's the English word. It actually is an exact translation of the Greek word for poetry, for poiein.
Yes, yes.
And that word make, and Chaucer pronounced mock. See, you have to go back before the vowel shift there. Now, Chaucer says of this fellow that he knew how to make songs.
The cauda is, we translate that as could,
Yeah.
and that is what it means. But of course, it originally meant know how to do.
Know how to.
Know how to do something. See, one of the things about reading this Middle English is that it refreshes your knowledge of English. You realize that word could, which to us means nothing.
We throw it away.
It's just
right.
zero. It means it's just it means absolutely nothing to us. But when you read it in Chaucer, you say, oh, that means something. That means he knew how to make song, and make is such a significant word, as Mr. Senior says, that the poet is a maker. The word artist means someone who is capable of making something. He could make songs and well indeed, which means not only could he make the songs, but he could find words to go with the song.
Yeah. He could indict. E-N-D-I-T-E, not the legal indict, a totally different word. No.
Right.
Well, maybe not. It might very well be.
It may be related.
Indictment was actually originally a written thing, but it means compose the words. That's the point.
And he could make up the melody and
the
the
words.
lyrics, as we call
the
them. Yeah.
And gee, what a wonderful thing. Now, the reason why that line came to my mind is I was in a harangue here. I was saying, you young fellows, you get out there and you do this. That is, these are accomplishments that you must, if you're going to be a Christian, gentle man in your generation, these are things that you must be able to do. And there is something totally wrong, and wrong is not strong enough a word. There's something wrong with our education. You have not been brought up right, and we're responsible. We were the generation that brought your generation up, so we're at fault here, but wow, something went wrong. Once upon a time, when a young man came up to manhood, he was taught how to do certain things. And first things first, he knew how to ride a horse. By golly, that's it. He knew how to make a song and to indite the words. I mean, those are accomplished. He knew how to play a musical instrument. Our education. Oh, I have to tell you. Just the other day, I read in a newspaper here in one of our local cities, a young man who was the valedictorian of his class, just graduated. We're now making this tape in graduation week here in the spring. And oh, what a bright guy he was. He never had less than an A in his entire high school career. He's a high school graduate. And it says that he could play the violin. And he had won a Kansas contest for the violin. I began reading this. I thought, gee, this guy is really something. And they interviewed him, and they said, well, you have a scholarship. You've won a scholarship. Yes, he said, I have, but that's not the important thing. He said, a lot of students make mistakes. They study in order to win scholarships. But he said, that's not the reason. I studied because I wanted to learn. He said, that's the real motivation. My eyes, lit up. But boy, we got to get this guy. And then he said, in fact, I have accepted a scholarship. And he named some famous university. And he said, I'm going to major in physics. And I got mad. I threw the paper down and I yelled at my wife, and I think she just gets annoyed with me when I do things like this. But that's a terrible thing. That is a bright young kid, and they're going to ruin him with physics. What a waste that is. What a waste that is. And I don't think anybody in the world agrees with us about this.
Yeah, that's right. They'd say, well, that's where the bright young fellows ought to go.
I was angry. I had a picture of him. He's a nice-looking fellow, and not freaky or he didn't look that way at all. Oh, that he never got less than an A kind of scares you. I must admit.
Yeah, that's a black mark. That's one black mark.
That's against him. But I mean, he really was bright, and he did say good things, and he praised some of his teachers and so on. But he's going to major in physics, and everybody thinks that's great.
Yeah.
And what we talked about this before, that's going to ruin his imagination. He'll go into that physics, and he'll be good at it. He'll be good at it. And he'll get into that, and he will never use that mind of his. He will never go beyond, that he'll never learn. They'll shut down his imagination, and he'll never learn. And he'll think that he is, and he'll, perform experiments and talk all that physical jargon, and who knows, come up with fusion or some damn thing like that, and win the Nobel Prize. And you think that he could have been a squire. he could have been somebody who, that kid ought to do is learn how to ride a horse. And learn how to play. Lord, he knows the violin, although I suspect that he plays, in Bach. Bach.
Oh, Bach. Yeah.
They get them into Bach.
Yeah.
Whereas this young fellow played the flute. He played love songs. He didn't play those scientific physical exercises.
I just read a little bit of the autobiography of H.G. Wells. Mm-hmm. And it is dismal reading. I must say it's dismal reading because there is a man of great energy and great mental capacity, and even, you would say, of some imagination, who was ruined by his education.
By science.
By science. Yeah. He went into science and it destroyed him. His only outlet was writing things like The Invisible Man and, the
War of the Worlds.
The War of the Worlds and all those science fiction things. That was all there was. Otherwise, he was engaged in writing. When he wrote a few novels,
he was a socialist,
which were often, were very, very tendentious kinds of novels with theses, But he ended up writing books like, I went over to the library and I got one of his books called Work, Wealth, and Human Happiness. 2 volumes elaborately illustrated with all of the wonders.
Let's have another drink of wine. I can't get through that without another drink of wine.
It was what a dull book it is. What a dull and all wrong. That is, it's all about controlling the world. How we're going to control the world. And you think that man didn't have to turn out to be that way. People liked him. G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc liked that man. And he must have been really very remarkable.
Well, again, you have to say, I've never read much Wells, but I have read The War of the Worlds and The Country of the Blind. Mm-hmm. And he does have an imagination. He is good at what he does.
Well, I'll tell you how I came across him. I ran across a quotation that has to do with wonder. And it's a marvelous quotation. He says, in this very book about work, wealth, and human happiness.
That's a horrible title.
Well, he said that I realize that the world that we live in, this little world that we live in, is surrounded north, east, west, south by wonder. And he said, every once in a while I get an urge to go outside. Within this world, we understand everything. Inside this world we live in, we can understand everything. We may not, but we can understand everything. But then I know that outside of that realm, there is something mysterious, and every once in a while I get the urge to go out there and look around. He said, but for the most part, I'm very content to stay here in this little realm where I can understand everything. That says everything about H.G. Wells.
What he did is he became a socialist, and a socialist is he's a mechanist of society. That is, he's a guy, well, the word social comes from society, and he's a socialist, as he turns it into an ism.
The last chapter in this book is how everything in the world can be managed. Everything can be
planned
managed.
Economy, planned society,
everything.
Planned parenthood.
Yeah.
Oh, planned religion.
No, this was written actually very late. You forget that Wells lived in the 1930s. And,
he went on, didn't he?
Maybe even longer.
I think he lived up to World War II.
Yeah, he did. This book was written in something like 1930, and
he was still
the naivete of it is appalling. It's just appalling. You look back on that. If I could make a book required reading, I would make every freshman coming into the university read that 2 volumes. Rather deadly, full of
you've got
funny
an inoculation theory.
I think they would all say, "Oh boy, if that is."
Give a guy a little dose of smallpox and
they would see. I think most of them would see. They'd see the folly of that book, they might even see. They'd say, "Well, gee, I thought H.G. Wells wrote these the books about traveling through time, the time machine, and all those things." You'd say, "That's right, he did." But look at this. This is what he took to be the business of life. Is writing books like this. They'd say, "Oh, something happened to that man." The destruction of imagination.
So, we forget the meaning of the word anthropos. I think we talked about that word anthropos. Well, everyone says, well, it means man, and you say, yeah, it appears in words like anthropology, which is the study of man, or misanthropic, which means somebody who hates man, or philanthropic, which means etymologically anyway somebody who loves man, or I don't know, there are all kinds of words that have to do with anthropos. But if you stop looking at the growth of the word in its extension, and you look intensively inside the word, you discover that it comes from, I don't know if we talked about this before, we probably did, it comes from that same word verse. That is, the word tropos in Greek is the same word as versus in Latin, and it means, and you were just saying this half an hour ago, it means to turn. It has that quality of verse.
And
anthro, it means up.
Turning upward. The word
upward.
Name
now,
Andrew is the same as the
andros,
word.
Andros is the man who looks up. And the thing about science is that you look down. I mean, science is contrary to the nature of man. We're talking now about modern science. That's science in the laboratory.
H.G. Wells science. And he knew it. Oh, he knew it.
And in the sense that young man is going to go off to an Eastern university and study physics. That's in that sense that he's going to go into the laboratories and and he's going to look down, and he's never going to look up. He's never going to look beyond his own intelligence. Our intelligence is not the end of the universe. We are not the highest creatures, let alone the creator. And what science does is take the intelligence as the measure. It was the sophist who said, man is the measure of all things. And those old Greeks, they summarized everything, didn't they? That is, that philosophy, man is the measure. That's what the scientist believes. That is, our intelligence is the measure of everything. Now it's exactly contrary to the very definition of intelligence. That is, man is made, anthropos is made to look at something beyond himself. That is, his intelligence is a reflective thing. And if if we look up at the stars, that is in the poetic sense of the stars, we are in the lyric mode, that is, we are susceptible then to being lifted up, and we will see something higher than ourselves, not arrange and control something lower than ourselves. That's why I say I was really physically angry when I read that article in the newspaper. I just took it as an emblem of the whole damn generation. That is, they're selling these kids into slavery.
Yeah, well, all those very bright young
they're grabbing them down in grade school and they're turning them onto science. And you look back at this squire. I said, I think he's the most wonderful guy in the whole poem. That's not true. He's not. He's not at all. But he sure is a wonderful emblem.
Chaucer just loves this young man.
He just loves him.
He thinks he's, and he makes fun of him too.
Oh yeah, he thinks he's funny.
He thinks he's funny. Chaucer, of course, is famous as a humorous poet, and he is. He's the funniest, the greatest humorous poet. Certainly, he is perhaps the greatest humorous poet who ever lived. And but it is a generous kind of humor. That's why I said that I rather like Edward Lear, because Edward Lear, he's rather Chaucerian. He has that poem about how pleasant to know Mr. Lear.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Lear is a rather funny man. I mean, he really, his figure is entirely spherical. That's doggerel. And he weareth a runcible hat.
Nobody knows what that means.
Nobody knows what that means. But he's a modest man who thinks he is himself rather ridiculous, and doesn't think very much of his accomplishments. Although he was a very accomplished man, he could do a lot of the things he could sing, for example. He said, "Well, I used to be a singer, but now I'm one of the dumbs." He said, "I've lost my voice." And he could draw. Edward Lear could draw just as he could here.
I didn't read those lines. No. In the next couple of lines here, this fellow not only he could a song as mock and well and neat, juiced. Now, juiced means joust. That is, he was a great player. Well, it's a military game.
With the lance and the horse, yeah.
And ache, that is, means also. Now you have to pronounce this dounce. At least my teacher said D-A, the A becomes ow, so you have to say dounce, or it's dance. It really is dance. He could dance. Now that's, again, we've talked a little bit about dancing, I think, before on these tapes. I think we told the story, didn't we, about the Greek young man we knew who did the dancing?
Yes.
I mean, we're not talking about a bunch of crazy kids sitting around wriggling like like worms on fishhooks to some sort of rock music. It is a very intricate and athletic performance. But then it says, "Just ache dance on well portray." Now that's draw, portray, and write. Now, write here, it doesn't mean compose, it means he had a beautiful handwriting.
Yeah, it's handwriting.
He had a hand script, but the word portray there means that he could draw pictures. And I must say, gee, you do have to love those guys. We talk about them all the time. They were heroes of our father's generation, Chesterton and Belloc.
Yeah.
They did really revive those things. When they wrote letters to each other, they drew pictures, marvelous pictures. They were good. I mean, they were amateurs. They didn't pretend to be, great to master. They didn't pretend to be.
Well, Chesterton almost did go into art. He was that talented. He was that talented.
Yeah. They illustrated their own books or each other's books.
Yeah.
Now, you said that Lear could do that. Quite a few of them could do that.
Oh, Lear was.
Yeah.
He was a genius.
Yeah.
Lear was a genius in illustration, comic illustration of a sort.
I think our readers or our listeners probably never heard of him.
I'm afraid not.
Edward Lear, Lear, and he wrote a book called Nonsense.
Well, he's
Nonsense Rhymes.
He's the one who really invented and perfected the limerick.
Yeah.
The limerick. Now, other people had wrote limericks before, but he perfected it. He is the greatest writer of the limerick. Now, a limerick is by definition a piece of doggerel. That's what it is. But it has a kind of perfection about it. It's the perfection of doggerel, I would say.
Right.
The limerick is the greatest.
Well, I made a joke about Shakespeare when we were talking about this before. The verse is more important than the poetry sometimes.
Yes.
I'm willing to say sometimes, by golly, that stuff is just in itself a marvelous thing.
Oh, it is. It is. No, it's in a class by itself. Really.
You know who thought this again was T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
Who tried to do it, and it was not very good.
No.
And I think
his comic poems are a little portentous, a little portentous.
Yeah. He's affected, and
Yeah.
he, for example, when you were quoting that wonderful poem of Lear, Eliot has a parody of it. How unpleasant to meet Mr. Eliot.
Yes, that's right.
And he's right.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Eliot is not a humorist. Eliot is rather a nasty.
Yes.
Which is all right. We need nasty men too.
Yeah. No.
It's a different temperament. But he's not. He doesn't have that. But T.S. Eliot, I don't remember now where I heard this. I'm sure I think he has an essay on Edward Lear.
He may be the one, in fact, from whom
he
I
kind of discovered Lear.
Yeah, I think he may be the one who says that there is poetry in Lear. That's what he says about Kipling.
Because Eliot is so smart. I mean, as a critic, he's really a genius. And again, Eliot liked Kipling.
Yes.
And
he says the same thing about him. He says he just writes verse for the most part, but he says, although he's not a poet, there's poetry in Kipling. Oh, he's right. He's really right about that. He's got that just right, and the same thing is true of Lear. I think he said that.
And it's certainly true. That is that again. See, T.S. Eliot wrote in the 1920s. After World War I, and I think it really is true, the world came to an end in World War I. And T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and some of the other younger poets of that generation tried in a sort of a desperate way to revive it. Ezra Pound has one of his best poems. He says, I thought I could quote it, and I'm afraid it's slipped. It's been a long time since I've read it. But he says of himself, writing a kind of autobiographical verse, he says, born out of his time, 20 years out of date, something like that, he tried to resuscitate the dead art of poetry. And Pound wrote, well, he did, and he failed. I think what we have to say is that they did not do it. But they saw the loss. And what T.S. Eliot said was, we've lost this. We can't write doggerel anymore. And T.S. Eliot saw that if he wanted to be a great poet, that he would have to do that. Eliot was a great fan of the music hall.
Yes.
Which is the cheap. It's lower than vaudeville. It's
vulgar.
Burlesque. In America, it has to do with something really quite vulgar.
And smutty jokes and that kind of thing.
And girls, taking their clothes off to music, but they did it to music. And there was a kind of art. I remember when one of the famous girls back in my childhood got arrested. Her defense was that it was art, that it was not pornography, and I think she had a point.
That's right.
She had a point. Or there was Gypsy Rose Lee, or one of those. There used to be in our childhood, there were these famous striptease girls, and they
were called striptease artists. I must say, yes. That was the term.
They were dancers. They had an art.
Sally
Rand. Oh, she was the most famous. She danced with a fan.
These great, large, plumed fans.
And she was great.
Yes. Yeah. She never revealed anything that she shouldn't reveal.
That's right. And there was a whole institution in the United States based upon that. Well, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound were right about that. They said, you cannot have a high culture without a low culture. That is, the low culture is the soil, the vulgar, earthy thing out of which this high art comes. If we go back to the age of Chaucer, we can see that Geoffrey Chaucer's art, which is on the highest level of art in the whole history of the world, was based upon a popular art, which he describes here in Squire. The squire was not a poet. The squire was a young soldier. But he could write poetry. He could write songs. He could sing, he could play, he could dance, he could draw, and he could write in a beautiful hand, calligraphy. Well, unless we can restore those things, we're never going to restore the high things. Because the high things come out of the low things. This is a tenet of our faith, I think. That is, humility is the basis of our faith. And it's a tenet of our philosophy. That is surely one of the worst errors, if not the very worst error, and we've talked about this a lot, that you can make in philosophy is to think that we're angels. That is, that we're nothing but minds, and that we can solve problems by metaphysics.
To forget that all knowledge begins in the senses. Right. All knowledge, absolutely. As St. Thomas says, all knowledge. I mean, it's absolute. All knowledge comes from the senses. Starts with the senses. All our knowledge.